Hi everyone, Brad DeRoche here. Welcome back. Today is lesson number 11 in our series of 30 short lessons on guitar fundamentals. In today's lesson, we're going to focus on how to reduce left-hand finger noise. All right, so let's jump right in. First and foremost, in order to get rid of left-hand sound, we have to remove a filter in our mind or in our ear that we often put in place, maybe inadvertently, but nonetheless it's there for many of us. And that filter filters out the sound of squeaks and chirps and splats and other noises that we produce with the left hand, and to the point where we really don't even notice them anymore. I'm sure you've heard people play Villa-Lobos Etude number 1 many times in the past, and I've often assigned this as a piece for many of my students, and you know this is the classic arpeggio piece. Anyway, in the middle passage here, when it does this long chromatic chord shape, this diminished chord shape here, you often hear this move from one chord to the next. And so on, all the way painfully from the 10th fret all the way down to open position. So in that passage there, the sound is certainly not wanted, and for any audience member, they can hear those squeaks in between the chords louder than the chords themselves. But for us as players, we filter that out. We no longer hear it. So the first step in really cleaning up your playing is to remove that filter that many of us have in place. How to do that? I would suggest you record yourself. Of course, becoming aware and just thinking about it is very helpful, and that will go a long way. But I think if you record yourself, you'll really start to hear what actually happens in your playing. And sometimes recorders, because of the way that they capture sound, are sort of brutal, and in that they put forward a lot of bright, squeaky sounds that come out of our playing and make them even more present than they might be in a room. But nonetheless, it can be a great teacher for us. So consider doing that, recording and maybe just listening for string squeaks and extraneous noises. Try to find a way to clean those up. So step number 1 in getting a cleaner left-hand sound is removing the filters. All right, so that's very important, becoming aware. Step number 2 is the physical aspect of how to get rid of these squeaking sounds. The reason that they squeak is because our fingers are sliding on the bass strings. It's really only on the bottom 3 strings that we have to worry about this. Of course, the trebles, when we slide up and down on those strings, it doesn't make much sound. Bass strings, it does. So we're dealing with the 3 bass strings, and it happens when we slide on a string. Now, how to get rid of that? What I suggest you try to do is to do a little tactic that I think of as lift, then move. All right, lift, then move. So if we were to take a look at that Villa-Lobos example again, right here, this chord shape, if I were to play this chord shape, I could slide down to the next shape, which is exactly the same chord shape in the left hand. And when I do that, we get the squeak because the fingers are on the bass strings here. One after the other, all these painful squeaking sounds. Or I could lift, then move. Lift, move, and so on. And so what we really have to learn how to do is to lift, then move, and replant to the next position here. So in this example, no sound in the left hand. All right, so I can do this without creating all those squeaking sounds by lifting, then moving. Okay, so now that's the second point that we have to really learn how to do, is to lift, then move. And it's not every single spot in our pieces that has those squeaks. It's usually just when we're gliding on a string. So we have to listen for them, become aware. That's step number 1. And then 2, when we find those spots where we squeak, we have to remember to lift, then move. Now, in many cases, when we're playing one of these bass notes and we're squeaking on a string like that, there's a way to fix that or to make it easier rather, by keeping a guide finger on a higher string. So in the Villa-Lobos example, when we're playing this chord shape, we actually have 2 fingers here that are on treble strings that could stay on the string and glide, serve as guide fingers, while the other 2 lift and move, which is what I was doing in that example when I played it a moment ago. I lift and then I move, but I'm actually not lifting this finger. I'm going to keep that one in place. I do typically lift this first finger. It doesn't need to lift, but it's a little easier for me to make that particular move here. So I lift 3 of them, but I keep the little finger as a guide finger. So as I'm going through there, I'm not producing any noise because I'm doing the lift then move, but I'm also keeping a guide finger on the string, which helps to give me more legato sound and a smoother transition from one chord to the next. It makes it a little easier. So that example. See, no noise in the left hand. So I'm keeping a guide finger going, and it helps me to play that example more cleanly. There's another simple example from Tataga, which I've played in a couple of previous videos, but it's the piece Lagrima, and we have a movement here in this opening position or opening section of the piece. Now, a lot of times when I hear people play that, their filters are on and they too bad. Those sounds really are distracting, especially for people that don't play guitar. And they don't really know why we produce those, and so to them that's kind of an ugly sound. So for me, at one point in my career, I had to make a conscious decision about those sounds, and I had to treat them as if they were errors. So they're really the same thing as playing a wrong note. They're not supposed to be there. They don't sound good. So I try to get rid of those if I can. So we can do that same thing: lift, then move. Here's the chance right here. Since I'm moving that same chord shape, I'm going to lift, second finger, then move. But I also can do the guide finger here again, as I was telling you just a moment ago. So I've kept the little finger in place as a guide finger. It gives me a nice legato sound and no noise. All right? And so on. So look for examples where you've got squeaks in the piece like that from left-hand movement, and try to see if you've got a guide finger maybe on a higher treble string that would allow you to move and glide and keep a nice legato sound without the noise. So that sometimes helps me in a lot of passages. Okay, another thing you can do to try to reduce a little bit of the left-hand noise, it's not a perfect way to do it, but you could use the trusty lip balm that I showed you in some of the other examples. You can just touch a little bit of this on the fingertips here, rub that into the fingertips, and it's not the best thing. It's not going to reduce all noise. You can't just suddenly move around with no left-hand noise at all. You can still squeak like the Villa-Lobos. It's still going to squeak if you do it, but it might reduce just a tiny bit of noise. Now, if you're not into using lip balm or Vaseline or whatever, you could just rub the sides of your nose or your forehead and get a little bit of natural oil from your face on the fingertips. Now, a lot of times people do that for the right hand to make the right hand slip through the strings a little more quickly. It feels really nice. But it can also be used on the left hand, and it helps us to glide up and down the strings without sticking to them. So that's another thought to help reduce a little bit of noise. It's not perfect and has minimal effect, but it does work a little. And then the last part of this, the fourth thing to think about here is finger splats. And I actually talked about those in the previous lesson, so I won't go into great detail here because we already did cover it. But the splats occur when you don't have enough pressure or you're too far away from the fret wire. So remember in the last lesson we were talking about this, when you get too far away from the fret wire, there's kind of nasty splats. So here's an example if I use Lagrima again, where I could hear the splats and the squeaks, and it's pretty noisy and it doesn't sound so good. So I'm getting here some up on the treble strings, some on the basses. So when you hear that, it's not a very nice sound. It's not pleasant. So instead, we could try and get rid of the splats and the squeaks and make a much more legato sound by getting right up next to the fret wire like I talked about in the previous lesson. so that we're not squeaking, and it cleans that up and it sounds much better. All right, then lastly, for a little exercise that is I find very helpful to do to kind of work on shifting and getting rid of squeaks. I take this from an old Carlovaro technical drill, and it's where you do a chromatic scale. Now, in the Carlovaro book, I believe it was done on the 3rd string, but try it on the 4th string, or 5th or 6th, one of the basses. Just play that simple chromatic pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4 frets in a row, fingers 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're going to slide up 1 fret. I could squeak the whole way, or I could do the lift and move, like lift and move. Now in his exercise, it was actually called the squeeze shift. So we were trying to bring the first finger into the 2nd position while the little finger was still playing its note. So here's the slower example. Move. Anyway, the idea is that I'm lifting and moving while I'm holding another note. You have to get the timing right on it, but it reduces the noise, so I don't have the squeak. And so if you practice that little exercise just for a moment when you're first starting out, it can also give you a chance to make sure you're getting right by the fret wire, getting good left-hand position where you're right on the fingertips and all that stuff that we talked about in the previous lesson. And then lastly, don't forget to do it in a descending fashion. It's the reverse. And when we would shift downward, it's the first finger that causes the squeak going downward. So we do a squeeze shift, bringing this finger in. You get the idea. All right, so in those examples like that, just a simple little technical drill can make us aware of the sound that we're making and help us to fix the problems that we have in our playing that create these noises. So just a quick recap. First and foremost, number 1, remove the filter in your mind that allows you to not hear squeaks and splats in your playing. All right, that's crucial. Then secondly, do the lift then move when you're sliding along a string to get rid of the squeak. Try to keep a guide finger on the higher string if it's possible. That sometimes helps to make it sound a little smoother, more legato. Third, you could try lip balm or oil from your face to kind of lubricate the fingers a little bit so that when you're sliding, they're not quite as noisy. And then lastly, take care of those splats on the strings by making sure you're right up next to the fret wire and you're not playing in the middle. You're getting right there and you have enough pressure to hold the note down clean. All right, that's it for today's lesson. I hope that this helps you a little bit. Keep practicing and we'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.